Hello, this is Jason Thomas. I am going to try to give a concise definition of what the term subject music means. Now, this is a term that I came up with in around 2004. I may be a year off in either direction, but this was something that I started using as a term to describe a very specific type of music. And it's not just my own, although my compositions from that point forward would certainly fall into that category. It's not exclusive to works that I have done, or even necessarily people that share the same intent or goals. Any piece that fits a certain criteria could certainly be described as a piece of subject music, whether that be the intent of the composer or not. So again, 2004 roughly is when I started using that phrase. And I will kind of go into the practical side of what a piece of subject music might look like. And then more importantly, after that is done and out of the way, the reason why this is something that I think is important to consider and at least be aware of whether this is something that you wish to engage in, or specifically wish not to. There's an entire spectrum, just like there is with numerous other aspects of a composition. So first off, the practical standpoint. What does it mean practically to be a piece of subject music? Well, this involves the way that the piece comes into existence. Now, first off, if we look at the traditional notated music of the past, most of the time, we're being told what to do to an object. Not all of the time. There are certainly score indications that tell us what something is supposed to sound like. But most of the time, we are told what we are supposed to do. You take this object, a musical instrument, human voice, whatever it is, and you do this thing to it. The resulting sound, we assume, will be what we expect, but we don't necessarily get a guarantee of that, as we don't get a guarantee of many things in a musical performance. So the primacy lies with what we are told in the score, and that is usually the direction of the physical object. Press this button at this point in time. Now, I remember in 1997 or 98, when I was talking to a string player from a well-known string quartet in the Boston area, and they were saying, I wish these composers would stop telling me what to do and just tell me what it's supposed to sound like, because, I play this thing a few hours a day, and some of them might think that I kind of know what I'm doing, and I had quite a bit of agreement with that statement. I remember years later seeing a composer in the early 2000s that had a flute and electronics piece, and every single one of the pitch indications on the flute was accompanied by a specific fingering chart above of what fingering the composer wished the performer to use. No indication of how those directions were supposed to sound afterward. Now, obviously, this is part of a larger issue for another video of the composer as expert, or the composer / professor figure that many people envision themselves in. But I remember thinking back to the violinist who had made the initial statement, if only there were these people that manipulated these objects on a fairly high level and devoted several years of training and perhaps a couple hours a day to doing exactly that, maybe they would know what they're doing, and maybe a more efficient way to tell them what to do would be how you expect it to sound. And it's worth taking a momentary diversion to go into how we don't expect such degree of specialization in implementation from a military general or a company CEO, for example. We know that they are looking at the big picture. They don't necessarily know how every specialist is supposed to do what it is that they are doing. They give a set of requests, and those requests are within certain parameters implemented by others that have a greater degree of expertise in that specific area. And there seems to have been a point when composers became academics, or even beforehand, that concept has just gone off the rails, and we're looking to composers to be experts rather than creative individuals, and not only experts in a particular thing that they do, but an all-encompassing expert, which is usually problematic in many areas of life, because there aren't many humans that fall into that category. But in any case, I digress. The contrasting approach for a piece of subject music would be, rather than to say, here's a series of objects to be performed, or a series of events to be performed on objects, a series of buttons to be pressed at a particular time, here is a particular set of sonic results that are desired. Go about that in whatever way. Now, you could apply that philosophy to any style of music, any type of composition, and you would have no idea, if you were listening to a piece of music, whether it were necessarily composed in that manner or not. This is entirely about the practical aspect of getting things done, which, again, I'd like to get out of the way. It's important, not the most important thing, but this is just an overall large-scale 30,000-foot view of, from a practical standpoint, how would you go about doing that. Now, you could certainly have very traditional goals that represent, or that end up resulting in music resembling that composed with a traditional score. That's totally fine. However, if you stop assuming that as your point of departure and say, this really does prioritize a few things musically, pitch and rhythm, for example, a lot of other aspects of sound that you could just as easily request are not necessarily prevalent in a score to the same degree, unless one goes out of their way to make that the case. And there are a number of examples of this. To what degree are two sounds considered to be in a group? To what degree is one particular sonic event intended to resemble another one, with the exception of perhaps a particular parameter? I'm speaking very vaguely here for intentional reasons. But I just wanted to kind of throw out that if you get rid of the idea that what you're requesting is particular actions on particular objects, you may find out that that has other implications depending on what it is that you want to request. You might find that the parameters of sound that you're interested in from a composition standpoint do not resemble those that are typically documented in a traditional score. And by traditional score, I mean instruments represented on conventional notation. So that would be a practical aspect. So why all of this back and forth? What's the point? The practical point is that you have a much better shot of getting the sonic result that you want if you're actually requesting that and making that explicitly clear, rather than assuming that someone performing a physical object at the right time in the right way will necessarily lead to the result that you want. I think it's very important to understand you're never guaranteed a good performance, no matter how good the performers are, no matter how good your notation is, no matter how good everything is, no matter how the stars align. It's never a sure bet. However, it is worth noting that everything can go perfectly. Everybody can do everything right, and the desired outcome can still not occur. This, of course, can be the case with someone making their requests according to how the desired perceptual outcome should be perceived later. That's not a guarantee either, but at least you're starting from a point that doesn't involve another level removed from your desired outcome. So that would be the practical reason of why you would do that. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, this is much, much, much more important. And this is a totally different decision, if you want anything to do with this or not, of why you would pursue music that I would consider to be a piece of subject music from this standpoint, rather than just employing the practical techniques. As you can hear, I have perhaps some visitors in the background there, but I'm going to let that noise die down a bit. Not sure if the siren is going to bleed through for a moment, but we'll let it die down there for a moment. So even if you decide that you want to go along with the practical aspects and you can make some use of that for conventional means or for non-conventional means that just happen to differ from my interest, that's totally possible. A separate question would arise from, do you have an interest in what subject music is or can be from a philosophical standpoint? And to answer that question, it's important to start with, what would the reverse be? What is something that we take for granted? And an interesting aspect to consider would be the music of Harry Partch. And I bring this up in relation to his book, Genesis of the Music, where he uses a term that I'd never heard before, which I don't think originates outside of his own text from a musical standpoint. And he refers to what he's doing as corporeal music. Corporeal meaning of the body, that one would have a bodily response. Now, we think of many aspects of music. We think of tonality, we think of rhythm, we think of presentation, we think of timbre, we think of a lot of different things. Very rarely is it discussed to what degree someone intends for a physical response. Not just how are these objects manipulated from a physical standpoint themselves, and to what degree is that the focus of a composer's intent. But having done so, to what degree is a physical outcome desired? Now, in the case of Partch, that is the visual spectacle of the instruments that he designed, the dance component, and from an informal standpoint in some of the pieces that are kind of mentioned incidentally in some of the scores, and presumably some of the physical results that one would typically receive from that type of artistic experience. Forget any musical composition for a moment and just look at film, because it's very easy to draw an analogy from something that's so explicitly visual. Think of a few genres that have not only a focus on the physicality of what is going on in its documentation, but a physical reaction in the listener. I can think of a few that are fairly prevalent in that regard. There is comedy, there is erotic film, and there is suspense or horror. Not only is the body the subject that is documented in all of those circumstances, or largely in all of those circumstances, but a particular physical result in the listener is expected. You hear people saying things like they were on the edge of their seat, or they got goosebumps, or any number of other things that one could say about those types of experience in the film or visual media world. Well, what would the opposite be? If we're not focusing on the physicality, we would not expect that type of result. We would expect a more cerebral experience. And coming to a piece of music that is intended to be subject music with the expectation that those type of experiences would occur would be setting oneself up for disappointment before even arriving at the event. And that is the important point that I hope to get across regarding this term. The practical aspects are important, and anyone can use them no matter what they're trying to do. But those that hope to go a step farther into the philosophical element of what I would call a piece of subject music from that standpoint as well would want to look at the degree to which their piece is expecting to involve not just the bodily and physical aspect of how it is presented, but the reaction and perception of a listener or perceiver. So what are some examples that would make this highly abstract discussion kind of brought home in a way? Well, the first thing that I would recommend that everyone do, if this sounds even remotely interesting to you, or at least not totally crazy, is to get a copy of Immaterial, which is the book of 100 imaginary pieces that I had composed and that Mark So had edited for presentation. You can go to any of the major online retailers and get a copy of that. If you absolutely don't want a printed copy, you can write in the email that will be documented here, and I'll get you a digital version. So the first piece in that collection is called Immaterial, and it simply says, imagine a sound without a physical source. So that's kind of an icebreaker to get us in the realm away from making the physical presentation of the piece primary in our experience of it. Every one of the other pieces occur in such a way that they could only exist in the mind, or that they need only exist in the mind. For example, there is one called Switch Piece that says, imagine two simultaneous sounds, vary your focus from one to the other. So this is something that we need the mind actively involved in to do. We can be nudged along by performers in the physical world in other contexts, but we need only the mind to do any of these, and in some, we can only utilize the mind to do so. So that is a collection of 100 very short imaginary pieces. So check out Immaterial for that purpose. Now, there's nothing innovative about that, by the way. There have been many composers that have done imaginary pieces, and the vast majority of them are attempting to conjure in the mind of the listener physically produced sounds. What I am attempting to do is to attempt to state aspects of sounds that I wish the listener or perceiver to experience that do not necessarily reference the physicality of the means of production of the sound at all. So why do these need to be imaginary, for example? Well, they wouldn't necessarily have to be. However, pieces that are short lend themselves to that type of realization in ways that longer pieces do not, just because the mind tends to kind of float and wander if we are given too much rope to allow it to do so from a time standpoint and from a complexity standpoint. So for these pieces, they're all very short, less than a page, a simple concept that you can kind of understand and then imagine the piece without referencing the texts. Other pieces that I have done that I would still consider pieces of subject music do involve realization by physical objects or performers. They simply do not state the technology that is to be used. They state the desired result that is to occur, and to put it bluntly, you figure it out to the performer. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. First off, it doesn't need to be a performer. It could be tape for subsequent playback or electronic realization for subsequent playback. That's fine too. But a series of desired perceptual events is indicated. Someone can go about that however they wish. A group of people can go about that however they wish. Someone can type into a computer however they wish. As long as the perceptual elements are present later on, then I would consider that to have fulfilled its obligation, or to fulfilled its expectation as a realization of the piece. Again, realizing that a successful realization is not always or even frequently guaranteed. So that would be an example of a physical work that takes the approach of subject music. An early example of this would be a piece called Event Variables that I had written that indicates with simple numbers how many events a particular player is supposed to sonically sound at a given time. And rather than stating accents or other criteria that could be present in the sound, I simply indicated that those meant that the group should be perceived as a group rather than individual entities. There's a number of different ways to make that happen. So I'm taking a very specific aspect, perception as a group rather than perception as individual components, and just saying make that happen. However, if that particular aspect occurs, then great, I'm happy. Another example would be a work that involves very high frequencies toward the edge of human hearing, that a sound with an immediate decay is played underneath, and as long as three things happen, you fulfilled the function of the piece. The first of which is in the immediate attack portion of that sound. One does not hear the elements at all, of the high frequencies rather. The second thing that would occur would be that they would be perceived briefly as a component portion of that other lower sound. And then the third aspect of which would be when the other sound, presumably lower in frequencies, died away, that initial sound would be perceived on its own. So you've got the same sound perceived in three different ways. So my instructions indicate something very similar to what I just said, and if you make that happen, then you succeeded. I don't feel the need to tell someone why that should be a plucked string or a tam-tam or one of 15 other things or more that could easily make that happen. I just care that it happens and that someone is able to achieve that perceptual result. So you may have an interest in the physicality of work. You may find yourself interested in the Harry Partch approach of wanting a physical result, wanting an outcome, wanting something that does relate to the body. And I think it's important, regardless of what anyone wants in any situation one way or the other, to understand that there is a spectrum here and one's desires can fall in some type of intermediate state or in an extremity on one side or the other of those desires. It's kind of an interesting thing to me that when we make an advancement musically, and when I say we, I mean people overall on a very global scale, not usually an individual, but when we make an advancement, it often relates not to doing something necessarily new or discovering something innovative, but simply realizing that a restriction or a tautology that we had expected is not necessary, or not advantageous, or both. So if you believe that the physicality or the corporeality of a musical experience is necessary and advantageous to what is either already there or something that you want, then these ideas would not be particularly interesting or useful from a practical standpoint. But if you like the idea of having a different cerebral experience with a piece that does not necessarily need to relate to the traditional aspects of presentation that would lead to what one would potentially call a bodily response, and what some have called body genres in other art forms, then these ideas might be much more interesting to you. So if any of those ideas sound interesting, first place to start is in material. Again, there is also a recording of me simply reading the introduction to the book on this channel, just verbatim as written. If you want the actual pieces, you need to get a copy of the material, either in its digital format or printed, which you can get either from me or any of the major retailers. But in either case, I look forward to having people potentially share their thoughts on and experiences with this concept overall. And thank you for listening thus far. This has been Jason Thomas describing what is subject music. Thank you.